Here is a Telefunken model RC200 cassette deck. I found this at the dump and repaired it almost exactly 8 years ago, back in 2012. I still have it, and when I gave this a test recently, it turned out this has developed some more problems. If I turn this on, I had to replace the motor 8 years ago, and clearly the motor that I put in as a replacement has not stood the test of time. This is too loud, so I'll have to replace that motor yet again. And if I put in a cassette and playback works, as you can see, but fast forward doesn't. Rewind is very slow. Now, this would seem like it was the typical problem with bad idler wheels that don't transfer enough torque to move the tape. But it isn't. If I take the cassette out, push in the back piece to trick the cassette deck into thinking there is a cassette in there. If I now press fast forward, you can see it's turning quite happily, and it is really strong. I can barely stop it with my finger. So clearly it's not an idler wheel problem. Now if I press rewind, you can see, even without a cassette installed, it still is slow. Well, here is the thing. This supply reel, this is seized up. This is really difficult to turn. As you can see, I can barely do it just with one finger. So I'll have to take that apart. And the final thing that might turn out to be a problem, I did not replace the capstan belt 8 years ago, and it was already loose back then. Here is the cassette deck taken apart. And here is the front of the mechanism. You can see the brakes up here, but even with the brakes applied, the take-up reel is easy to turn, while the supply reel takes quite a bit of effort. So this just pulls off, and right there is where the problem is. You can see there is kind of a bearing in there, and this has sticky grease in it. Here is the back of the mechanism, and if I now try to maneuver the camera around, bring you in a bit closer, you can see right down in there is the back of the troublesome supply reel, and thankfully I can just go and push this in from the front, and there it is, and I can now take the entire thing out. Yep, there we go. And here is how you can clean the inside of a bearing like we have right here. You pull a string through the bearing, you soak the string into alcohol, and then you can pull it back and forth. And that way you can get all the bad grease out of there. For easier reinstallation of the supply reel, I took out the reel motor that normally sits in this space. I put the supply reel in with some fresh lithium grease, and I'm happy to say this now turns really freely. And right there you can see the two troublesome idler wheels that stop these RC200 cassette decks from rewinding and fast forwarding, but those have already been fixed 8 years ago. And just after I said that, I get to find out the idler wheels are acting up again. The way this works is the real motor turns this idler wheel, which has a small diameter tire on it. There is a clutch, and then there is another idler wheel with a larger diameter tire, and that drives the take-up and supply reels. My repair back in 2012 was I took out the small diameter idler wheel and put the large diameter idler wheel into its place, and then I brought in an even larger diameter idler tire and put that on here. Now the problem is the inner diameter of this idler tire is bigger than the inner diameter of the original, so there is a gap between the idler wheel and the idler tire. Initially that worked, but now this is where the problem is, because the large idler wheel is just slipping on this wheel. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to revert to the original condition. I'm going to use this idler wheel and this idler wheel, but I'm going to treat them with some number 400 sandpaper, hopefully restore the surface of them a little bit. The real motor also has a rubber tire on it, and as you can see, this has quite a groove worn into it. And this is after I treated this tire with the number 400 sandpaper. I didn't want to sand it until the groove was fully gone, because I have a feeling by that point I will have taken away too much material. It's that deep. So instead, I turned this rubber tire around on its pulley, and hopefully that's going to make this work a bit better. I just had another idea, took off the take-up reel, and yep, there is another bearing. Not a surprise, but this one was in much better shape than the other one. Still, I cleaned it. Couldn't take it apart to do so because it's right behind the flywheel, so it stops. But I got it nice and free now, as you can see. And another thing, the clutch in between the two idler wheels would not transfer enough torque, so I went in there with the number 400 sandpaper, roughened up all the surfaces, and now, finally, if I put in a cassette, look at that. It's working. It's not the fastest, but that is by design, unfortunately. Rewind works as well. And it rewinds all the way to the very beginning, which before treating the clutch it would not do. And another thing, before I forget to mention it, some of you may have noticed the pinch roller in the last scene was very shiny. I took the number 400 sandpaper to it, and now it looks like new again. So, sandpaper is absolutely essential in repairing cassette decks. Let's turn our attention to the next problem, the noisy motor. And I have the perfect replacement, this motor. And if you've watched the first video about this cassette deck, you'll notice this motor looks exactly like the original motor of this cassette deck that unfortunately went bad. Simple reason, this motor came out of a Telefunken RC 100, the entry-level model. Replacing the motor in this cassette deck is very easy. You just take out 2 screws to release this mounting plate. Here is another problem. White oxidization on the flywheel under the belt. This seems to happen when a cassette deck is stored for a long time in a humid environment, and it only happens where the rubber is on the flywheel. See, if I turn this a little bit further, you can see this section was not in contact with the belt. This section was. Well, this oxidization is another application for, you've guessed it, the sandpaper. The new motor has been installed and also the flywheel cleaned up nicely. Switching the cassette deck into playback mode reveals another idler wheel deep down in the mechanism, but I still got there with the sandpaper. And in case you wonder, I do clean off the idler wheels after the sandpaper treatment with window cleaner, which is essentially diluted alcohol. I have done some testing playing back cassettes, and I think I would like to replace the capstan belt after all. It's just too loose. Now, unfortunately, with this mechanism, that's not so easy unless you disassemble the entire cassette deck. The problem is, right all the way down there, you can see there is this standoff that holds the circuit board in the back. And the standoff is what holds the back plate for the flywheel. Right there is the back bearing for the flywheel. It holds that in place, and then it also holds the circuit board in place right there. It's a bit of a strange arrangement, and I'd like to get this apart without disassembling all that. So I'm going to take out this screw, which is easily accessible, and force the back plate away. And hopefully I can get enough clearance between the back bearing and the flywheel to feed the capstan belt through there. And that's the new capstan belt in place already. It was reasonably easy. This screw turned out to be a bit of a problem. The original one was stripped, so I couldn't remove it with a screwdriver. I had to take out the capstan motor and get in there with some pliers and remove the screw that way. I also removed the real motor for better accessibility. And, well, the belt is maybe a tiny bit more tight than what would have been perfect. I did find in my box of belts the perfect size, but unfortunately that belt is so old and hard and cracked, and it even has a groove worn into it, so that would not have been an improvement over the original slightly loose belt. And here is how to lubricate the capstan without taking the flywheel out. You can see we have this transparent washer on the capstan, and we carefully pull up on that, and then we can go ahead and apply a tiny drop of oil, like so. Let that flow into place, and then turn on the cassette deck and let the capstan turn and work in the oil. I'm going to let this run for a little while, and then obviously I'm going to push this transparent plastic back down again, and that is going to keep the oil from coming out of the bearing and onto the capstan and then onto the tape and pinch roller. I noticed there is a lot of hum during playback, and you can see the output signal right here, and here is a fast Fourier transformation which shows me the frequency contents of this waveform. And as you can see, the fundamental frequency, the highest peak, is at 50 Hertz. And that tells me this has nothing to do with bad capacitors, because in that case, if there was a bad rectifier, this would be the fundamental frequency, the highest frequency, at 100 Hertz. So we have a problem with shielding and not with capacitors. And I found one thing that I can do, and I'm going to demonstrate this. So as you can see, the peak-to-peak voltage of this disturbance right here is somewhere around 60 millivolts. And what I'm going to do now is I have a piece of metal shielding that I'm going to put over the top of the transformer. And as I do this, okay, that's on there. And as you can see, we're now down at around 50 millivolts. So that has made quite a difference. There it is, the transformer with a metal shielding around it. Before I'm able to set the speed, I have to take care of another problem. As you can see, the belt does not ride exactly on the crown of the pulley. It's slightly off center. Now, if the belt had drifted off all the way to the sides, that would mean it's either too tight or too loose. In this case, it means that the motor with respect to the flywheel is misaligned. And that is the fault of these rubber inserts. If I hold the motor manually, you can see the belt instantly corrects itself and rides on the crown of the pulley like it should. So I'll have to put some washers in between the screws and the rubber to raise the tension to bring the motor into the correct position. That took some experimenting. I actually had to put 2 washers into the top mount, but that's much better now, and it's not going to get any better than this, because this is also where you're starting to notice that after all, this mechanism was built to a budget, and this motor mount is a bit wobbly. You can see all of the metal is also bending around there. So I can now set the speed. And here is another deficiency of this mechanism. If I press play, you can see the entire head bridge has some play. Well, that's what happens when you hold it together with these sort of clips. The heads have been cleaned, the capstan has been cleaned. I fixed this door so that it doesn't get stuck inside anymore. And now everything has been put back together. Let's give it a try. Here is a test recording I made a few minutes ago. And now you probably say, well, that doesn't sound right. Well, this is how a high-com recording sounds when played without high-com. So let's correct that. Well, I would say that sounds pretty good. So, last but not least, here is a hidden feature. There is a reason why they call this style the direct load and lock mechanism. It's very direct. Thank you for watching.